So now I'm going to experiment a little bit with recording and doing a voiceover and trying to improve my technology. So we'll see if this works. Okay, so eschatology is basically the study of the end. And in case you needed an earworm, you can think about it's the end of the world as we know it. Here are some of the key terms that we'll engage today. So eschatology comes from the Greek ta eschata, which means last things. So eschatology is the study of last things. The kingdom of God in many ways is a Christian eschatological vision for what is to come. The challenge, however, is that Jesus already came proclaiming that the kingdom of God is near. And in some scholarly circles, they believe that the kingdom of God was embodied in Jesus. And so if Jesus already came and the end of all things came near, how do Christians then deal with the reality that the world is still a mess? Which is probably even more evident now as we're responding to a global pandemic. What is the Christian response to a global pandemic? Spoiler alert, it is varied. Lots of different communities are responding to this idea differently. So there's different forms of eschatology. One is called futurist eschatology, which suggests that God's reign will intervene in human history and disrupt it. There's inaugurated eschatology, meaning that God's reign has influenced human life, but will be fully realized in the future. Some Christian communities refer to this as the now and not yet. God's victory over sin, death, and all the forces of evil has been declared, but we do not yet live into that reality. Realized eschatology means that God's reign has already been realized or has come in Jesus. And now it is the task of Christian communities by this ideology to continue living out and bringing forth that notion of the kingdom of God. The realized eschatology is often promulgated in liberal Christian circles, if you remember that lecture from the previous unit. So eschatology is wrapped up in notions of apocalyptic literature. Apocalypse just means revelatory or revelation. So this literature envisions there's a cosmic battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil that's played out on the earthly stage. Apocalyptic literature, as we learned when we discussed Revelation on campus way back when, before we were learning online, is not confined to Christian literature. Some of it is secular. Daniel in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament and Revelation are regarded as containing apocalyptic elements, meaning there's a notion that there's some sort of a cosmic battle played out on the earthly stage. So modern expectations come largely from the ideas of premillenarian dispensationalism. This is the idea that history is divided into phases and that we are in the last phase. This ideology also tends to have predictive elements that will look at world events and suggest that they correlate to events on a cosmic sphere, meaning as the world becomes more unpredictable in people's ideologies, that God's reign is coming more near to right that. The only problem with this idea is that many generations have thought that they were at the end. This viewpoint really started with John Nelson Darby, who was a contemporary of Charles Darwin, who we learned about in our last unit on in our Enlightenment lecture as well. All right, Once upon a time, I actually called this number, and I've been getting robocalls ever since, warning me that someone has cursed me, which is kind of interesting because when I actually called the number, they gave the right answer for when the end of the world was going to come, at least according to the Bible. They said, the Bible tells us that nobody knows the day or the hour that the end is coming. Um, we also had some medieval debates about the end of the world or the end of all things. Will people be the age that they were when they died, or will they be a different age on the other side? What is hell like? For this, we get a large amount of imagination from Dante, who writes, "Through me, the way is to the city dolent. Through me is the way to eternal dole. Through me the way among the people lost. Justice incited my sublime creator, created me divine omnipotence, the highest wisdom and the primal love. Before me there was no created things, only etern, and I eternal last. All hope abandon, ye who enter in." One of the medieval debates is actually in the movie Coco, where we see a young boy who crosses into the afterlife while he is still living. And so we see that the people who died are actually the age they were when they died. Okay, why heaven? Why hell? There have been some modern critiques of hell by theologians who argue it does not fit with the notion of a loving God, that it contradicts the notion of God's power over evil. If God is all powerful, even over evil, why the notion of eternal torment? What purpose would eternal punishment serve? And it seems to represent vindictive justice. And this idea suggests that, like, why would Jesus have been sent if God's intent is vindictive justice? Theologians have attempted to answer these notions, oftentimes by appealing to the notion of God's justice or God's righteousness. And then justice. Theologians have attempted to answer these notions, oftentimes by appealing to the notion of God's justice or God's righteousness. And then it goes back and forth, where some people say it contradicts the notion of God's power over evil. Then other folks would argue that it means that God must hold people to account for their actions. The other side would argue that couldn't God find a different way to hold people to account? Anyway, there have also been critiques of heaven. The Marxist notion is that heaven helps people tolerate suffering in life, so it's a kind of a figment of people's imagination, created to make them feel better about themselves. The Christian response to this, however, is that it provides hope in this life and facilitates striving to make the world a better place. Other notions of the afterlife draw notions of the future into the present. The idea here is present both in the sacrament of baptism and in the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, where Jesus has promised to be present, at least according to Protestant ideology, and draws God's reality into our reality, where people are baptized into Jesus's death and into Jesus's resurrection before they have physically died. In the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, people are drawn into God's feast even before they have been resurrected. Oftentimes, persecuted people groups look to the eschaton as a time in which all will be made right. So this is another view that when there's no ability to appeal to justice on the earthly side, people often appeal to justice on the other side of this life in order to create a narrative that preserves the notion of a faithful God. What is a faithful God doing in the midst of suffering? Well, ultimately, God will make all things right in the end, would be the argument. And between now and the end, according to this Christian ideology, what people have is faith that God will ultimately make all things right.